conversation series, and this is the ultimate conversation, not the penultimate, the ultimate conversation with our colleague Larry Foster. But I do want to do a couple of things first before we get to hear what Larry has to say, and also field some of your questions. I see from our folks at a distance that the sound is good today. There's a little sibilant sound on my end, and I know it's not because I have problems with my S's, so that's something about the... Okay. Okay, so Larry, if you could turn your microphone down one more notch. I'm getting technical advice. The speaker, if you could turn your speaker volume down one notch, or put on headphones, one or the other of those.
Okay, well, how does this? Is this better?
I think the issue has to do when I speak, because you're picking up me on your end, and that's what's causing the sibilant sound. So the speaker, so that would be the speaker icon up top. If you can do that down one notch. Is that right, TJ? I'm giving directions I shouldn't give. I think that's right.
Well, I have a manual volume control here on my laptop. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yep. That's good.
Okay, I have it down pretty good now.
Okay, let's try it again. Let me keep talking here. And that's good, I think, from our, thanks to TJ Lynch, who is manning the controls. There's a little bit of S's in the background, but ask that you just, at this point, listen beyond that and see what we can do in the conversation. And if Larry talks more, there's no problem. So we can get going on that. Just want to express thanks to those of you who participated throughout the year. We've been doing one conversation a month for about an hour and a half, and have invited a number of people to engage with us, starting with Pete Titleman back at the beginning of the year and circling around some of the articles in our book of the year. So many of you have been reading that faithfully or sporadically, whatever your workload would indicate. We're making plans right now for our conversations piece next year. We're going to evaluate, so you'll all get some kind of feedback form so we can do some invitations for next year's conversations, and we will be picking the book of the year in August for next year, so that you're aware of that. We have a great opportunity for membership network folks in May. Our option that's available for all of you is to participate on May 20th with our Leadership Series May event. We invite someone here to Columbus once a year to give an all-morning presentation and then a short afternoon presentation. So Mickey Cremone's going to be with us in May, and you can either join us in person here at the Martin DePorres Center at Ohio Dominican, or via livecast. We'll be livecasting that, and that is part of your membership gift, is to be able to do that from a distance. So check out our website, and you can get more details about that, but mark your calendars for May 20th. We've got a lot of activities this summer, training of trainers, and we have an intensive leadership series for 3 days at the end of June. So if you're interested in some three-day theory and coaching experience, myself and Tony Wilgus will be leading that. So I invite you to consider participating in that. That's been a really wonderful opportunity for many folks who can't do the one Friday a month leadership series that we have going during the year. So I want to just say that any one of you at a distance can participate in this conversation, but you do it by your chat box. So I'm going to keep an eye on comments and questions, including what's going on around the sound. And thanks to Gail Zackerson, who's saying that my sibilant S's are at least tolerable. So we'll move ahead with that. But if you're having major technical difficulties with something that our tech people, which is TJ, our tech person, needs to know about, if you'd send a private message to him, that would be appreciated. So I'd like to welcome the Reverend Dr. Larry Foster to our conversation today. Thanks, Larry. Larry's a long-serving pastor. He's a coach, and I think he's known for being a systems thinker. One of our facilitators has described Larry as, and I quote, a sage, spelled S-A-G-E, sage. Larry works with congregations, and he works with resource teams. He works with ministers of all denominations, and he's served as a resource for judicatory heads in a variety of different denominations. I'll say this, Larry, I hope you take it as an absolute compliment, but you go back to the days when Ed Friedman was offering clergy gatherings, and you actually had the experience of studying and being with Dr. Friedman. And I will say, and this is an East Coast expression, Larry does a wicked imitation of Ed Friedman and Murray Bowen. So that is one of his gifts. So welcome, Larry.
Glad to be here, Dr. Ott.
You're going to call me Emlyn, aren't you?
Okay.
So I think I'll start with you the way that I have been with each one of our conversation partners is if you could say a little bit about what prompted you to get involved with and be intrigued by Bowen theory.
Probably reaching midlife with accumulated experiences around what developmental prompts I've been following. I think several career experiences have sort of come together in a way that you kind of lean towards curiosities about life. And family living is central to that, I think. I'm an only in a situation where I have two older half sisters, and parents come from Pennsylvania and were largely limited in their education. And so they, after the Depression, my parents came to Michigan to get a job, to work, after the factories started picking up. I've always had an interest in how to understand other people. Later on, became more myself. But I think the areas of psychology, sociology, anthropology, those areas were always interesting to me. I started out in college as a major in electrical engineering until I bumped into calculus. And that was a kind of a hook in the road. So I turned towards the humanities and the behavioral sciences. Growing up, I experienced the church window onto reality, as well as my family process. And in terms of relational foundations, I had a good experience in the church starting at age 8, where my mother sent me to Sunday school. And that experience growing up with a pastor who I could talk to about almost anything was foundational. My father encouraged me to play baseball, and I became a professional athlete for 7 years. And after that, those life courses tend to come to a fork in the road about mid-30s, or even before that. So I entered I got a master's degree along the way in social science. I entered the seminary and at a year at a time, and ended up being ordained and called back to my home congregation, which is not always the most advisable thing to do. And at the time, I didn't know what big triangle I was in. Wow. So I went back there for 6 years, and it was almost like a homegrown pastor becoming an interim back later on. And that course of running into those challenges of being an assistant and then becoming the senior pastor, I was always looking for ways to be more effective, to understand the dynamics. In 1979, in the continuing educational yearnings I had, I went to a conference in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, if you've ever heard of it. And there was a large gathering around the issue of the family puzzle. That was the theme. A rabbi was there named Ed Friedman, and he talked about emotional triangles and anxiety. And the way he was putting it together really resonated with me. So that got me tweaked. And I went on to explore avenues toward that, trying to understand what he was talking about. In the seminary training we had in those 60s, lots of emphasis on T groups, sensitivity training, and even transactional analysis, these efforts to understand the human potential. And I was always interested in that rather than so much liturgical renewal or social action. I was more interested in the pastoral care, pastoral counseling aspect.
Well, that goes to the
So,
understanding of people.
1983, I entered a DMin program at the Reformed Seminary in Holland, Michigan, trying to figure out what systems were and the difference between systems and systems and systems, and got a DMin there. And in 1985, I stumbled into a conference, a one-day conference with Friedman up in Minnesota, where he was introducing his book, Generation to Generation. And there were 12 of us there. He had the whole day there listening to his intro. I got on his mailing list by doing that. And there was also a program up in Minnesota by Mary Bowen offering Bowen systems training. She was a member of the first generation that Bowen trained at Georgetown. I spent 6 years there with her, and Bowen and his faculty would come over there, so I had a chance to know him and meet him and work with him a little bit. Um, so that's part of the background of what got me interested and what prompted me and where I took it or tried to take it early on. I was in the congregational ministry at the same time, so this went back and forth. The experiences in taking him to these sources of information and reflecting and being put back in my own family process.
Mhm. What, so what kept you going, Larry, over that period of I mean, that's a long time, and you've been engaged since the 60s and being not only intrigued about people, but intrigued about how systems and triangles and detriangling might work. So what's been the grout that's kept you going in all of that?
Natural systems came around the thinking of a larger picture of how human interaction takes place. And the efforts I made to get into the psychodynamics and behavioral and sensitivity aspects rarely seemed to be useful even with my own family. I mean, they were reality checks that set me straight right away if I tried to, you know, teach them about what it is. I backed off of that. And I think all the experience I've had, both in baseball, sports, and in the Army, and all these things have kind of represented the fact that not much goes to waste if you're trying to figure out um, how this stuff works and how to get better at it. Um, I think the way it got put together, thinking wise, made more sense. And that's why I say I think it takes some experience maybe to come at the point where you're starting to ask these questions. I think Dr. Bowen said something like, "You couldn't hear this hardly before you're 35."
I was going to
I do
ask you
think
about
people
age
can hear it.
earlier.
I'm sorry?
I was going to ask you about age earlier when you made comment about maturity. So
Yeah.
Jung also said nothing before 40, so that there is that accumulation of experience and then beginning to be able to look at what might be a larger picture of life. You know, it's interesting you're talking about T groups and sensitivity training, and I think about that as kind of it's so different than an approach that is oriented around concepts of how people interact with each other, and it actually might even be considered opposite to the way that Bowen and Friedman talked about
Mm.
the development of maturity. So we had a lot of ministry training for many years around sensitivity rather than clarity and grounding and so on. Do you have any thoughts about that? How that impacted us and our profession, our vocation?
focusing on the individual, I think governed a lot of our programs. Not that they were unuseful, not that they were bad in themselves, but what I think systems offers is another level of understanding the forces that are impinging and acting on our relationships. And it's more than just individual psychodynamics, even though that can be an aspect. When Dr. Bones saw that the individual is only a fragment of a little larger emotional unit, that that's a major shift, I think, particularly in how we organize our thinking. And the way we conceptualize stuff tends to determine what we do about it.
Sure.
Um, and I think
I
Friedman
notice,
picked up on that.
yeah, please go ahead. Mhm. Please go ahead. You were talking about Friedman.
Yeah, I think he discovered that what Bowen was putting together theoretically in a new way put together what his experience was. I mean, his phrase was at one point, "Oh my God, he's put together everything I'm experiencing in the congregation."
Mhm.
And so Friedman took the theory to organize his own thinking. He wasn't necessarily trying to promote to research the theory as much as to use it, as I understood him, what he was talking about. And that relationship between the pioneer and the explorer, so to speak, has always intrigued me, and how two major thinkers who work together as master disciple, or however you characterize the relationship, was is kind of a spark of watching how this stuff stimulates thinking and creativity. Um, so I call it the axis. That's been kind of the way I've talked about it. More on the relationship. It's almost as if 1 + 1 = 3. I mean, you get them together and you get something bigger.
Mhm. I'm writing that down. I was just thinking about then the encouragement that for people who are applying Bowen theory and Friedman, I say Friedman application is the way I describe it too, as being further explorers, and that maybe even what Dr. Bowen even indicated that new things would be popping up, so new pioneers emerging, and that all of us are explorers too. Would you say that you're an explorer, and if so, in what way?
Well, the way I've been phrasing my functioning is being an advocate's devil. That is after everything you do, or all relationships are kind of the laboratory you're in, and you can use it anytime you want. And watching and being coached to when you slip out of into cause and effect thinking, and versus when you can see more process. I mean, this is an ongoing thing. It's hard work, and there's no easy way, I don't think, that it's. I mean, if you go out and try to teach it, you realize right away that's not always easy to do, particularly if you just do it didactically. And it's almost like a biofeedback model where you get some information, go out and work with it, and stumble around with it, and come back and reflect on it and get some more information. There's a reciprocity kind of thing that works, and I think that's the maturity track in a sense. If you're curious and you have some good sources of learning, um, who are not doctrinaire or too dogmatic about it, but it is an exploring of life, and um, just to know when you're stuck and what your options are, and having some maybe a little bit more choice in what you do with it, is having a leg up, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're talking, I'm thinking about the kinds of folks that are drawn into ministry leadership, ministry presence, tend to learn best by experience. So that there would be something that's intriguing about this particular way of absorbing how to look at the world, how to look at God's involvement in the world and their own functioning. But I notice, particularly with students in the seminary, a tendency to look outside self first rather than one's own functioning,
Yeah.
and that it may be mm, occupational hazard, and maybe gets reinforced by our training in some ways too. But do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, this crazy thought, I was thinking of Clint Eastwood, in the movie The Gran Torino. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I do. I love that movie.
The priest, he
Hmm.
started out struggling and trying to figure out what he was up against. And the movie has a coming around where he catches on, and so does Eastwood. I mean, they have the relationship that's was almost polar opposite at first, and then it sort of characterizes, I think, the importance of staying in there and maybe having somebody who can listen to you without trying to tell you what to do, but ask good questions and be interested but not interfere.
Hmm.
And the idea of persevering in it, staying on course, and have the capacity to self-reflect as well. And of course, in the training program, this means being directed back into your own family of origin where transference issues, all this stuff originate and how you learn to function. Um, so I think it's why it's called natural systems. It's more anchored in nature or in evolution and the living sciences. And I think that was a major um, shift, I think, in the effort here that Bowen made. And Friedman picked up on that too, but when he talked about immunology and some other things and biological models. So training, I think, to get your feet wet, there is a mentoring kind of coming alongside aspect that is a good ingredient. Friedman talked about most Pulitzer Prize winners were mentored along the way. It doesn't seem to appeal to everybody. Bowen saw that, and Friedman did too. Not everybody hears it or wants to even get into this. But for those who do, I think it contributes to the helping professions, deeper awareness of where to put your energy, because you can't know everything or do everything. I mean, how do you optimize your presence um, in a way that keeps you curious and appreciative of what people are dealing with? Because in a sense, every family has the same variations in their challenges. I think we're creatures, we're created co-creators.
I seem to notice, if I'm not mistaken, that is that your family diagram behind you?
No, that's the last seminar schedule for the
Oh,
academy.
well, that prompted me to ask what um, what you started working on with your own family of origin and where you've come to now. Can you look at for yourself what's been the long trajectory for your own maturity around your family work?
My experience was when I got back into thinking about my own family and the importance of seeing the bigger picture, the more than two generations, and Bowen's explanation or description of how these processes are part and parcel of interacting in what we are part of. Once I took that on for myself in my birth position, my experience in the family, it was a reorientation of what my memories were and kind of appreciating it more in depth what my parents were dealing with and what their parents were dealing with, and both internally in the family as well as the forces that come at the families in our society. So Um, it's one, I guess once you're bitten with this, it's hard to let it go. And it sort of opens up where the dots start to connect, and I think it opens up one's repertoire of how to respond to what you're facing on the way. Not that you are always successful, but um, it's like being in it but not of it in a way that you can watch your own anxiety go down, or you can see your blood pressure go down, or whatever markers might be useful as a potential. It isn't, and again, it's not guaranteed, but I think you can't get rid of all anxiety because we wouldn't be alive. But I think there's a sense in which you take on the responsibility for your own emotional being and where you want to go in life. And Bowen emphasizes having goals and being able to differentiate a self, which means a connected self. And I think that takes it into leadership issues because the system is interconnected in such a way emotionally and automatically that pastoral leadership becomes a, a what I call it, an amazing place to be functioning, even though you don't get paid a lot. But you touch a lot of lives, and it's not so much you're changing others or touching a lot of lives, but you're I think disposing yourself into a life-giving position that has more coordinates operating, and you're less likely to get stuck. And it doesn't mean you're not interested in other people, but there's a sense in which you're concerned for your own welfare as well as other people's welfare. I think Bowen talked about that. And the leadership emphasis, particularly from Friedman, I think suggests that we have more going for us than we think if we have a sense of how that works or how to put it together. Um, this idea of 6 degrees of separation is an interesting idea.
Mhm. When you say we have more going for us, you mean the human being, or do you mean the person in ministry life has more going for them? Or both?
I think the church,
The church.
the
Okay.
church has more going for it to the extent it can stay oriented
Mhm.
in a less chaotic way, or not. I don't mean that so much chaotic, but chaos doesn't have to be bad.
Mhm.
In a way that's present and accounted for in society, and what it has to offer that no other institution can offer.
Mhm.
That balance of spirit as well as facts. I mean, Bowen was big on how facts will lead us ahead. And I think where Friedman brings it is into this notion that leaders, particularly clergy leaders, are positioned in a field in which people who sit with clergy leaders are representing all kinds of systems. And to the extent you work on your own maturity in the faith, you're planning. There's an impact, I think, potential there of being a life-giving source to the community. So
Mhm.
how do you how can you build a differentiated community that um,
Right. Right.
doesn't get stuck in its reactivity, at the same time can work on its own maturity? Because all the issues of life are right there in the congregation.
Mhm. And I think about the attraction that folks in churches have to Bowen theory, Friedman application, and then some Richardson, Steinke, Foster, whoever else, that there's something about what we're engaged in that this gives us a bigger picture. But I was just visiting with an area pastor working with him yesterday, and he said it's so hard not to be drawn into the lament of his colleagues whenever he's in a kind of a colleague group, saying, "Oh, the demise of the church," and his own capacity is that there's just so many strengths that are at hand, and that we're in a position to be able to proclaim that, put it that way, or live it, I should say, or be it, probably would be more Bowenish.
Mm. Yeah, I don't think Bowen preaches, but it does
Right, right. It's a
guide
way of
living.
being, not
Mhm.
a pulpit. Oh.
Right. Oh, I sat next to a PhD psychologist in her 80s at a at a Wisdom of the Ages conference in Houston several years ago, and she was talking about her experience working with Dr. Bowen on her for herself, and she finally asked him. She said, "How do you, Dr. Bowen? How do you boil this stuff down so people can hear it?" And he said, "Well, let me think about that." And I guess the next time she bumped into him, she said, "Well, what did you come up with?" And he says, "Well, I would say brighten the corner where you are and quit your bitching."
I've often heard, examples of Dr. Bowen and Rabbi Friedman kind of engaging in those kinds of things. I know it's not my style, except for with those people that I'm closest to say something like "quit your bitching," but to to make that point in various ways, to point to the that it's what we do and it's our capacity. It's not something, again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about so easy for us in this world in the church to look outside ourselves rather than what we need to be about. And I think the bitching and the lamenting is sometimes is like that as well.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting that Dr. Brueggemann talks about the laments. One third of them, one third of the Psalms.
Right.
I often thought, I was wondering back when we have these praise teams, why don't we balance it with a lament team? You can go back and forth antiphonally in a church, maybe more accurate, kind of thing.
Well, and I certainly believe in lament. I don't want to diminish that. I certainly do. And I think it's a part of what makes the whole mature person, but not getting stuck in the lament and not getting
Yeah,
stuck in the praise team, too.
yeah. I think that the church is being challenged, I think, around what's it, how people are either listening to or just ignoring the church these days. They're so busy or whatever. I hear this from judicatory leaders too, who often lament that they don't have a lot of time to think. Um, and So there's no end of opportunity that's coming toward the leader. Um, it seems like the position itself is um, a natural spot to be functioning at the same time working on your own maturity.
I also think, I talk about this, Larry. Tell me what you think about this, that some of us have been incubated in families where we have been expected to do important things. And so then when we're put in the position of having a lot of challenges in the church, then we do an automatic of assuming a lot of responsibility and then not giving ourselves time to think and be able to see all into the bigger picture. Instead, we just focus on the anxiety or making the anxiety go away in some way or another, binding it without dealing with what's chronic underneath it. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, Kathy Kerr mentions that clergy tend to be special kids in their family. Um, she didn't spell it out, but it's a teasing thought.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the diagrams of pastors, ministers, priests, um, and social workers and doctors, there's an interesting um, question that come around. How did their family prepare them for what they're doing?
Mm-hmm.
I've seen ministers who welcome conflict and tension you look at their family of origin, and it's natural for them. They're in, born and bred in a briar patch, Bear Fox. The yeah, the development and um, training of clergy is an interesting challenge. I tell you, um, how does one even think about preparing church leaders for what's coming, so to speak? Because things may be getting tougher um, as the accumulation of various forces like limited resources and climate change and limited frontiers, and what else do they talk about? Increased population, um, 24/7 news, um, jacking up the anxiety. Not just one of those things, but the accumulation of all that, I think Bowen and Friedman talk about in societal emotional process, that leaders are going to be challenged because of change is changing for the faster. So it's in an age of perpetual novelty, so to speak. So, what does it take today to maintain the integrity of a self in the midst of all this and still stay open and vulnerable to learning more? It's when Friedman was asked about how does one know how well one is doing, he had this one criterion. He said, if you get up in the morning and look forward to the challenges of the day, you're doing pretty well. And I said, maybe at least 4 out of 7 days.
That's honest. Jim Grunow has asked a question, and I think that it will relate, Jim, to some things that we're going to move into in a few minutes. So I'm going to just say I'm going to keep it in mind as we start to talk about something that Larry's been involved in. This is one of the reasons that I've asked him to be part of this conversation. Larry's been an architect of a new, let's say, resource and adjudicatory. So I'm going to ask him, Larry, to talk a little bit about the Bowen Academy and explain how it happened and how it's operating right now. And then we'll work from there around how Bowen theory and coaching and all those things might relate to that.
I was anticipating that question.
I know.
Oh boy. Um,
Still thinking, right? Is that what you're saying?
well, yeah, it's a great question. Knowing that the challenge of trying to teach something that's got depth and emotionality and history and everything else in a way that not everybody agrees with. So, um, one of the current issues, I think, in trying to figure how to express, how to offer this without trying to sell it, okay?
Right.
But how to make it available, pathways to make available. And a lot of people, like you say, a lot of people are putting out their stake in their shops. Um, one of the issues that's being tossed around now is, when does this effort tend to shift into a how-to approach, a more prescriptive approach? And I think that takes it in certain directions, I think, and it's not bad, but I just think it misses or leaves out, and I hate to use the word process all the time, but it leaves out something else, another factor. So your question then is, how do I think about designing something that can be used?
Right, how that was thought about in the preparation for what you're experimenting with right now. And you're really
Yeah,
if I understand correctly, Larry, you are the resource, you're part of a team, but you're a resource for this way of introducing Bowen theory and Friedman application into adjudicatory at a kind of a foundational level or something. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, the way I would think about it is that I've spent 24 years in two parishes, two calls in my judicatory. And having sat at the knee of the rabbi and Bowen and others along the way, when I was 50, I decided at 55, when I was trying to decide whether to go to another third place and then off into retirement. And at 55, I could take a leave of absence and experiment with providing these seminars because the structure was useful by inviting people and saying, this is what I'm offering, and if you're interested, and this is what I found. In the first year, about 30 some people signed up, and I had two seminars in Michigan. Then it doubled, and then it doubled, and then it doubled, and it doubled. And I reached a point where I had all I could handle. It was basically providing a space that's non-political and confidential enough to people to do their casework and work on their families and stuff. And I've had a lot of exposure to this stuff. That doesn't mean I'm an expert, I have to say that, but a lot of exposure. And for 23 years, I did that after 24 years in the parish. And the next 24 years, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. But anyway, I found over the years that some stayed with it all the way, some checked in and checked out, so that the variety was there. But a lot of people who stayed with it found it extremely helpful in working with their transitions and working with their families and working with difficult families in the congregation, as well as pulling together some theological advancements in their own thinking. So it was it was several denominations involved here, including nuns and medical doctors and business people. And so the exchanges around these seminars over the years, I've tried to collect what was reported in their observable uses and outcomes of how what this meant to them. I just got a letter back this last week from a pastor in a conservative denomination who stayed in there and worked with this stuff and watched congregations implode and stayed on to to take part in interim ministries and this kind of thing. And this was 2010. He stopped coming to the seminar, and this is 6 years later. He comes back and says how much this has helped him, and he continues to do it. Now, those are little clues, maybe that it can be useful for people. So I did a seminar. One of my seminars was attended to by a judicatory leader in an area. And this person found that the seminar and its coaching and exchange were extremely helpful in the leadership position that this person served in, dealing with difficult congregations and problem clergy, as well as non-problem clergy. This person went on to be put into a head judicatory position over other judicatories. And at this point, this person inherited a situation in which this person felt like it was useful to bring in natural systems thinking as a process that could help lower the anxiety and help get people to think better at different levels of the church, so that the stuck situations and the reactivity could be dealt with a little bit more over time. And I was asked to do some retreats for judicatory heads and for church leaders out of the blue. And I mean, just call came on the phone, and said, I want you to do this. And that led to a request to design an academy approach to offering this for more local judicatory heads where they would pick somebody in their structure and send to a 4-year program in which we had developed a curriculum and so on. Is that responding to what you're asking?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Mhm.
So that we're in the first year of that now, full year. And so the metaphor that's been offered by one of the planners was we're flying an airplane while we're building it. So
It's a
it's been fun and it's been interesting. I'll tell you. I think the opportunity's there, and there's enough struggle out there to warrant motivation. But not everybody hears it. Not everybody wants to take part, but it does take a commitment.
Mhm. I was thinking about what you described as sort of, and again, a natural process of uh, people involved in judicatory leadership being exposed to this thinking and then making use of it in various ways that they operate. And then that leads to the development of something that would be maybe broader. But partly it has to do with the position of the person who is intrigued or curious too, and them
Oh yeah,
functioning out of that position, whether it's a head or in the middle of a congregation or whatever else. You happen to have the right combo of someone being exposed at a certain time, and then also wanting to stay persistent and present with this way of thinking, and knowing that their experience has been that it's been a good thing. Um, so this is an experiment, though, at that level. I don't know of any other denomination that's doing this, Larry, other than this particular
well,
one that you're working with.
well, the head leader is committed,
Mhm.
and that sends a signal.
Right, right, right. It's interesting. I was at in a meeting within my denomination for people who were preparing to work with folks that are in their seminary studies, and a person that I've known for a long time came up to me and said, "We have a new member of our congregation," and I was doing a talk about systems, natural systems, and leadership, and this person came up to me and said, "Oh my gosh, you sound just like my former pastor." And the woman said, "Well, who's your former pastor?" And she said, "Emlyn Ott." And so, so that there is this sense of little seeds of whatever are happening throughout either a denomination or in a synod or diocese or
Yeah.
conference or whatever, and planting those seeds in this way of thinking, and I guess operating to how you operate as well every day.
Well, there's another group that meets twice a year called the Voyagers. These are folks that have stayed in Washington, where they use the faculty of the Bowen Center as well as Friedman's faculty, and they bring in speakers and they try to stay in touch with the thinking and in both ways. And um, this continues to be a need to do this, to stay in touch, because the thinking tends to erode. And one of the Episcopal priests there said, you know, it's possible that this approach to understanding human behavior has gone beyond the fad energy
Mm-hmm.
of anything that's being tried and out there and tested and how to do this and how to do that, which isn't a bad effort, but it's what is it that gets beyond the faddishness of things and like an idea whose time has come, and then you got Dr. Friedman and described the parallel here with the early church movement. The rabbis talking about the early church movement here, and as you have the master and you have the disciples and you have the apostles and you have the church mothers and fathers down the road, and how the variations and where you take it, hybrids, and how do you stay with the essence or the central part is an ongoing challenge. And you start to hear that out there in the second and third generations. Well, did Dr. Bowen really say this? You know, or but people are taking it in different directions, which I think is very creative. Brain research and into biology, into medicine, into even the judicial work in the courts, in schools, so that there is a ramification for for certain principles. I think that are sticking around a while. And that's the thing too. You don't have to know everything about everything. There's certain principles I think you operate with that that can help keep focus. And the family is so central. By the biological family, and the biology of life, the science of life is so central. Even the theologians like Phil Hefner over at LSTC talks about, and then John Haught, a Catholic theologian in Washington. These guys talk about religion and science all the time. And where's technology taking us? What's our brain going to look like, down the road?
Mm-hmm. And our
This
thumbs.
experimented.
And our thumbs.
Pardon?
And our thumbs from doing all
Thumbs,
this.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
It's interesting. I don't know, Larry, if you know this, but our board for Healthy Congregations and a gathering of some folks that are not too far away and are engaged in the organization are going to be here tonight and tomorrow, just thinking about Healthy Congregations and its history, and also making some plans for next steps, which we're always trying to look at. And one of the things that we would say, we've been saying, that is particularly true about Healthy Congregations, for one thing, that it took off very well. And one could say it had that element of being a fad in a particular denomination for a period of time, in that there was a lot of energy and a lot of finances put towards it. Yet there is the reality that it was the only material that was developed for use in congregations themselves, and that was the kind of plan of seating and so on. So what thoughts do you have for this organization as we approach this conversation about what might be the next step of being available, or maturing, or do you have any thoughts about that at this stage of our life? And we're going to be consulting with Israel Galindo for 2 days, and he's going to be working with us around what we're talking about is Bowen 2.0 kinds of thinking, but what that might mean. Now, I didn't tell you I was going to ask this question.
That's okay. No.
Gosh, no.
Well, where my head goes in your question is that if the metaphor that I think Bowen used with his thinking had to do with describing the noise in the foreground that's always going on and demanding our attention, while the distant drum beat is always there in nature and instincts and so on. And as the noise gets louder, it can cloud out the more fundamental realities of life, I guess. And I think about the emphasis on what people turn to over the years in their resources. Now, Alban Institute now is out of business. And what's next to help lend a hand to an institution that's anxious, trying to survive and reproduce? When I work with individual congregations, I was struck recently by a conflict that erupted around a minister marrying a member after divorcing within his ministry there, and how the adjudicatory got involved and got reacted to and all this kind of stuff. I took on Friedman's recommendation of just working with the leaders at the top without trying to get everybody involved. Because the assumption in systems thinking, I think if you can work with just one or two leaders at the top, the whole place is in the process. Now that's a hard one, because people want help, they want consultation, they want something to do something. particularly the bodies. And I finally got a chance to meet with a congregation over a period of a 4-year commitment. But after the second year, things had calmed down. They appointed an advisory team for the president and the pastor and the vice president. And this advisory team was picked from their viewpoint of who had the coolest heads and less reactive. So the criteria for selecting advisement was already set up. As it turned out, maybe 2 or 3 of those have remained because that attrition is there. When it came time to have a more public question and answer time, the people who were dissidents showed up. And because it was kept low key all the way through, the dissidents showed up and they engaged in a one-on-one conversation with me, a couple of them. And these were old timers, long-term members who were disgruntled about the way things were handled and the way people were treated. It was a solid congregation. I mean, it was a very productive congregation, and they were having a great time, running a happy ship for a while. And I sat with 2 older women who individually talked to me about how frustrated they were that their kids did not stay in the church. And it sort of went together in my head that that generation has invested so heavily in some ways, and it's been their place to be and go during their development and growing into old age. And their hope for their kids, they're reproducing the faith in the kids. And a lot of them are saying that's not, and where do you put the blame for that? You blame the kids, you blame the church, you blame the pastor, you blame, and I never quite saw that as maybe one of the elements in the intensities that show up in congregations. I mean, kids are moving out, they're going someplace else, we're going to dwindle and die down. So that reproductive instinct, I think, is big in the church. And that's maybe why the sexual issues are so intense too. I don't know. I mean, it's just an interesting connection at the distant drumbeat level. So I think when it comes to lending a hand to congregational strength, my head goes to this thing where Friedman talks about how we conceptualize a phenomena to begin with determines what we do. And secondly, it's the emotional process that tends to govern this. I think those are the 2 themes in his book, Failure of Nerve. And then in his first book, which he developed out of, he talks about this template where the pastor, minister, priest, own family of nuclear and extended, and the congregational system and families in the congregation are interlocked in 3 emotional systems where it's the same emotional current. So when you see symptoms showing up, they can be understood in that emotional current. I mean, I think that's one of his thesis there a little bit. So those bookend books, the bookends of those 2 books are intriguing to me when it comes to living in an age of perpetual novelty, and everybody's so busy, and there's more intensity and higher level of anxiety and chronic anxiety. You can see it in the political process right now with the next coming election. I think it's just amazing. So the need for less reactive heads while staying connected and working on their own families, I think these are seed kind of like stem cell areas to work with. I don't know if this is what you're asking, but it's my sense of
yeah, I think
going back to where the nurturing aspect of the congregation was so important for me. And that didn't mean everybody got along. It just meant that, the field was an alternative to other stuff.
I think about what you say about conceptualization guiding, the trajectory, and then it's like the emotional process is the embroidery around there, and to expect the emotional process. But I mean, if we are going to think theologically and we're going to think honestly about human beings, then there is the capacity to think that there's something um, good and possible in the trajectory, as well as difficult and hard to manage. So even, even the lament, I'll use that word again, about how the church is changing and what people want out of church is actually quite exciting, as well as, so how you can keep an awareness and the capacity to see um, new life in the midst of change. I think even this spiritual but not religious trajectory, I think of it as a way for seeking for maturity, as the potential is there, how to be connected as well as distinct at the same time, in a new generation. So how to build in the excitement about what God might be doing in the midst of the reality of the pain and the loss too. I think that in some ways can be our the place we inhabit. And I was just working with a judicatory head, and the person was really struck by the fact that I said, I see lots of health in the church. I see lots of health in the church. And that, don't talk to and our and then my role is to notice it, and then to work on my own in whatever community that I'm a part of, which is in some ways sometimes really hard work.
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
think
and
reproduction,
a lot of areas to
the word,
explore around that.
yeah, I know it. Reproduction's a really interesting thing too. I remember Bob and I would, before we got married, we went to a premarital person, and she talked with us about reproduction, and she talked about it in a variety of different ways too. There's the
Yeah.
there's the baby thing, and then there are those joint creative capacities that she developed, and how to think about that more broadly in the church too.
Yep. Yep.
I think that's exciting. That's exciting.
Yeah, and self-regulation and self-definition and self-management in the middle of that. Um, what helps one function in a way that you can learn from it? I was thinking of the coaching aspect with people that Friedman talked about some football player who served on 3 Super Bowl champion teams was asked what had he noticed about any similar, what characteristics might be observable with these champion teams, and his answer, as I recall, and I don't know who this guy was, but as I recall this anecdotal story, but he said something about it has to do not with the talent, but you got to have talent, the capacities, but it doesn't depend on the talent or the necessarily just the coaching, but it has to do with the owners in a sense that they are deeply interested in the players, but they don't interfere. That was interesting. It's almost like parenting.
That really takes me into a whole different place. I mean, that's very interesting. I like that.
Yeah.
So and others know, my father played professional football,
Yeah,
and
that's right.
he was halfback and then played quarterback. But one of the things that I learned from him is what a quarterback does.
Yeah.
So a quarterback has to see the whole field.
Yes.
And that to me it was really helpful for me to think about when you're in a leadership position in a family or in an organization, to be able to continue to see the whole field, not just here to here where you're throwing the ball or moving or whatever. So he was able to do that on the field. He had more trouble in other places.
Yeah.
So as we all do, for whatever reason. So
That sort of relates to Bowen's illustration of systems thinking. I'm sure you've heard this, but it's like going from the 50-yard line up to the bleachers, where the bleachers you can see patterns that you can't see on the 50-yard line. but it includes the 50-yard line. I mean, the systems, the opening up the lens, the bigger picture. And like the quarterback does have to see more and see, the clergy the clergy are at the position of having to see more too. And Ed Friedman one time asked if you were going to design a church from the point of view of the worship committee or the youth group or the women's group, they would all come up with a different structure. Um, There'd be either the women would be a big kitchen. This is back in the old days. Be a big kitchen or a big recreation room or a big sanctuary. It's the clergy tend to be in the position to see, whether they want it or not. They're allowed to see the broader picture if they pay attention, I guess. I think he referred to that once, twice, three times. I don't know.
A million times. So, I mean, I'll go back then to healthy congregations things because there's a little
Yeah.
conversation in the chat box about the use of the workshops that were developed. Again, it was I think Bob Mathis was involved. Maybe you were too initially in the first pilot projects before actually the workshops came into being. But how they are resources, but not the be all and end all. However, workshops that are made use of over time
Mhm.
and not just done once and for all have a greater impact because it gets people thinking, but not everybody um,
Mhm.
responds to it or makes use of it or whatever. So it's sort of like offering opportunity, maybe persistent opportunity, but then what, one or two people, if one or two people become intrigued as a result of working with the workshops, that has some that has a certain amount of trajectory to it too.
So you're thinking about how to update the design or to rethink something or
I think we have to get in the bleachers. I think we have to get a little bit farther,
yeah.
I mean, so
Mhm.
your description of giving again that kind of bigger view, my dad's view of the field, is to think about what the bigger picture is in the church and the bigger
Mhm.
picture of what might be um, needed for the sake of the church that would be within the realm of healthy congregations. So the conversation here in the chat box has to do with um, is there an end to a presentation of material from a workshop, or how is there persistence to it, or is there greater depth to it that follows, and then whose responsibility is it to take the next step after the kind of material that we have in the workshops. And obviously we have in healthy congregations, and you were involved in the board for a while, we've made the decision to offer these conversations. We're doing the leadership series, we're doing a variety of other things to offer some continuity for those who are engaged with leadership of the workshops, but just you know, trying to get a bigger picture about now as opposed to 20 years ago when healthy congregations began.
Mhm.
So I can say to you, the Bowen Academy that you're involved in can only contribute to whatever it is that healthy congregations might be doing, and whatever Center for Family Process is doing, and the Bowen Center, and
Mhm.
what's it? There are so many leadership and ministry seminars, and what Margaret Markuson's doing out in Portland. There's a lot of things spawning.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
A couple of things Gail Zackerson is saying in the chat box. I'm in a lot of interim situations and currently ongoing pulpit supply. So she said she doesn't have the opportunity to kind of get the workshops in front of people. But I'll go back to some things that you said earlier, Larry. How the importance is that the application is all the time. It has to do with our functioning and even how we preach when we're in interims or whatever.
Mhm. what triggers in my head is what Brueggemann talked about in page 36 of his book, The Word Militant. I don't know why I remember that. He mentioned Bowen and Freeman in the triangling notion. When you take a text, I assume that a lot of our people tuning in here are going to be in the pulpit too. That so often the minister takes the text and speaks to the congregation about the text. This is what it says. This is what we need to do. Da, 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 da. It puts the congregation of people sitting in the pew on the outside of the triangle. Yeah. And he would recommend, as I understand his piece here, you get on the side of the people in the pew and talk about the text being not that, the challenge of the text, and whether you commiserate with the laments on the side of the pew people sitting in the congregation that struggle with the text, and you don't become the expert teaching the text. I think that's what he's saying. And an emotional process there was you're asking questions to the text yourself. And I think Friedman did something very similar when he said he'd take his questions to the text and then report on what he wrestled with on that. And the idea is people can overhear it better rather than being resistant to being told, there's something subtle in that, I think. So if you're an interim.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
As an interim or whatever, whenever you're in the pulpit, to what extent are you really into the energy? And in other words, how do you make that deal with your questions as well as what you're experiencing? And if you can get up in the morning, and some people stay up all night the day before, of course, and people describe different ways they handle their anxiety about preaching, but I think the idea is, how do you make that intriguing to yourself? I mean, the text is the word, so to speak, is a big part of what we have to offer in the church. And Brueggemann also suggested that people come to worship ambivalent. Or maybe even asking, well, am I going to hear anything today that means anything? I mean, others say that's a social attraction too. You'll be your friends and, and your memories, especially around commemorations or anniversaries. But one of the tasks I think he suggested is to help people process loss in their life. And maybe that's the lament connection, is to take the reality and have what we have to offer in the church is more than psychology, more than that, even though that's part and parcel of our human effort. One judicatory head said about the best thing he offers as an adjudicatory is a sense of hope when everything's changing so much. Hope is central no matter what happens. Other judicatory heads have their own way of being in it but not trying to be of it all the time, and what's coming at them. So in terms of healthy congregations and what kind of hand can it evolve into lending, what's been effective, there's a lot of markers on what's been effective, I think. I know I've used that anxious congregation one several times, and even though the phones are old, big phones now, they still hear the process, and you see these aha experiences. So finding time to think and to have a calm enough, lower anxiety situation in which you can step back and reflect, I think is always good. And whether it's issue focused or what, the leadership is important on that. If you're not getting anxious, I think Dr. Bowen suggested one time, if you can get the anxiety down one notch, it's a better world. And what lends itself to doing that? People have to make choices in their use of time these days, and what's going to bring them out is another challenge. So what we have going for us naturally in terms of life, death, birth, anniversaries, all these things are sort of the centers of celebration and what's the ceremonies that are already built into the minister's life, I think.
Mhm,
Sooner or later, you don't have to go out looking for it.
mhm, mhm.
I don't think.
Mhm. I was thinking about the capacity to, in leadership, to acknowledge the loss and to deal with it, but then to maintain the hope. And that we tend to get naturally in one direction or the other rather than um, kind of realistically looking at how one can live well and maturely in the midst of things that are constantly challenging too. Maybe that's part of dealing with unresolved attachment stuff. I mean, that we may be, because of family, attached to a certain way of interpreting things, one or the other, and how to get beyond that to see how faith and belief intersect with that. And of course, in my denominational background, I'm always into paradox, so I like that. And I want to say to those of you who are part of this conversation and overhearing it, that Larry and I discussed this, and we deliberately are not referring to particular denominations because we want to think about this as a broad paradigm rather than particularly related to a ecumenical partner of ours or one of our own, either one of our denominations. So we're doing that deliberately if you're curious, and I think some of you are based on questions. So
I don't
I
know if they can tell I'm Jewish or not.
yeah, I know. I think it's pretty obvious though. Although, see, this you got my cross behind my head here, so you know that's pretty.
Yeah, I should
But
have the
most
Star of
people,
David back here.
yeah. See,
Um, it's interesting in the introduction to generation, Ed talked about what unites us as clergy is not our theology, it's our stress, our entanglements with people, our attachments. Yeah, it's
yes,
interesting.
yes, that's nice. That's really helpful, Larry. We had talked yesterday about just you talking a little bit. I asked people to read Catherine Baker's article in the in Differentiation Self about a long-term coaching relationship, which was really interesting. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, but can you give some thoughts about your own approach to what is typically called coaching? Although I don't know as you would use that word to describe your presence with people, but what that's about, how one would go looking for someone with whom to engage the questions. Do you find do you find a franchise owner to work with, or what what are your thoughts about that?
I think the term came out of Bowen's use of it from couch to coach. Um, and then it's getting picked up by businesses and everybody. I mean,
Sure.
you can have a little 5-year-old girl said the other day, I'll be your life coach. um, I've done a lot of thinking about that, and um, just some aspects in my head would be something like this. If you're going to be into coaching, whether you're a coach or seeking a coach, realize it's you're taking on a hard learning way, probably if you stay with it. That doesn't is not absent with fruit at all, I don't think, and it's to make the contract very clear about what it is and what it isn't, and the ability to stay neutral enough along the way to address questions mainly with what, where, when, who, and how, and not why. Owen shied away from the why question because it gets to be so subjective. And I would think about, and I did this myself, looking for a coach with some clinical background. I actually hired, when I was into doing the DMin, a PhD psychologist diplomate in AAPC who was psychodynamically oriented, but he was open to what I was looking into. And someone, if you're in a church, a person probably with a faith disposition of some kind who can appreciate um, where you are and who can be interested but without interfering. I use that one. And who can ask the good questions. So that those are some things. People who have done their own work, who are still working on themselves, I think is useful. I think that's one thing Bowen kept from Freud is the having someone to talk to. If you are a clinician, you have someone you're talking to too, um, as well as transference thinking. So those are some thoughts.
How do you relate your experience in working with people to your experience as being part of a baseball team, a professional baseball team? What's been the carryover from that experience to what you're doing now or not? You had a coach there.
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't know if you also, did you also coach, Larry, when you were playing in Detroit?
Only afterwards. It's interesting because having all that experience, very few people approach me to coach. Some once in a while, a father would come to work with his son. Um, it's again, it doesn't go to waste as much as you can watch the tangibles and intangibles of a team when things really go together. What's going on? And I was watching New York Yankee manager who was there. What's his last name? Um, I'm having a blank on his name. He was there for several years. He's not there now. Joe Torre.
Joe Torre, yep.
When Joe Torre was hired, I think he came on with, he would do it if he had a general manager that he could pick. And my impression is the Yankees are loaded with money and tradition, but they're under Steinbrenner. This is confidential, right? This doesn't go out into the airwaves.
Yeah.
Well, if it does, but I think you could watch Steinbrenner up in the stand all over the place, anxious, and he was calling the shots. And then one season he seemed calm. I don't know if he got on meds or what, and they won. The team won better. And I think Joe Torre, if you watch some of these managers, how they manage themselves under tension. Um, And one of the best examples, I think, would be all the basketball coach for UCLA, John Wooden. I think he's a good example of how the team, the reciprocities between the team and a coach. He stressed just fundamentals, as I understand it. Just stay with the basics. And you'll figure out a way to adapt to the variations in your opponents rather than just focus on every opponent and trying to gear yourself to that. And there may be some value in that, but he stayed with he even helped the players put on their socks. So there was an attentiveness to a calm attentiveness, I think, and principled way of his functioning. I think that was useful and probably impacted the way the results turned out. And that's one possible way of thinking about it, I think, in sports. The manager and the anxiety in the manager seems to be a factor in the coach and how people are treated. Now, the idea that coaches can have different styles and still win. So it's more than just style, I think. And I was watching the Detroit Pistons one season when they won the Isaiah Thomas and the other. There's somebody who takes over in the group itself who can kind of spark things. And when they make mistakes, it doesn't draw them down as much as they correct themselves and still get in there. And my own experience in playing YMCA basketball with Get Up, people just coming to work out, where you'd play till 20 or something and get off, and the others would go on there, and you'd have to referee yourselves every time. This is an anecdotal thing, but it's every time I was reacting to somebody else's not passing the ball or over or dominating or whatever, rarely did we win.
Mhm.
When I shifted myself to, I got to focus on my staying in there and not getting reactive, catching my reactivity. I bet we never lost, kind of thing. Now that was just one of those little things along the way. Is how do you watch yourself in what happens, and what principles are available to you? What a self-awareness to open up your repertoire of choices.
Yeah, I was thinking about your example with Joe Torre too, about being able to manage ourselves in whatever circumstance, and we certainly are facing huge um, situation where there's a sense that we're going to lose in the church. But if we get back to what's basic to us and the self-awareness, I don't know if you ever watched the TV show Friday Night Lights, mostly about high school football, but
Yeah.
the major team before every game says, clear eyes, full hearts, can't lose. So it's all, kind of on the field. However, what it takes is a coach or a person in a neutral position who can see the bigger picture and also stay calm in the middle of it too.
Mhm.
So it's a great, actually a great story about, or a great series about maturing young adults too. What contributes towards maturing young adults?
Mhm.
Any other
There's
questions, folks? We've got like 4 minutes. I've got some good discussion here in the chat box and an affirmation about John Wooden's leadership here. I should say, 2 years ago in the class I teach on leadership, he was a major topic from a number of the participants in the class as an example
Yeah.
of mature leadership. So. Larry, do you have any closing comments? And I can just see if there's any other comments or questions in the chat box. But anything that you'd like to add that we didn't get to all the questions that I had generated, but I created new ones for you.
Mhm. Well, I was thinking about this quote from Bowen on leadership.
Yeah.
You probably have it.
Do I
Um,
have it right here? But I know the one you mean. I think. Do you want to quote it for our?
even though Friedman was the one who really took into the leadership thing, there's I think there's a congruency here with Bowen's quote. When one can find a family leader with the courage, or congregational leader, with the courage to define self, who was invested in the welfare of the family or congregation as much as in self, who was neither angry or nor dogmatic, whose energy goes to changing self rather than telling others what they should do, who can know and respect the multiple opinions of others, who can modify self in response to the strengths of the group, and who is not influenced by the irresponsible opinions of others. A responsible family leader automatically generates mature leadership qualities in other family members who are to follow. Um, that's a pretty good one, I think.
It's great. It's wonderful. We've got the we've got a request from Elizabeth Hoster saying, "I need chapter and verse for that quote, please." Which
Yeah,
can be. Do you
the
have it
best
right here?
source.
I don't have
You,
it here.
well, I thought it was in family therapy and clinical practice, but where I found it recently was in the Odyssey part
Uh,
of Mike Kerr's book on family evaluation. That's one of the summaries of Bowen's writings and thinking, if you want to get that Odyssey. It's about the last 30 or 40 pages, I think,
right.
where he writes a separate article.
That's where I've taken it from,
Yeah.
Liddy, so that you know. It's in Mike Kerr's book. Um, so, but are you saying it's quoted in something of Friedman's as well? Yeah.
I don't hear Friedman. I know Papero quotes it a lot, but I think the main source would be Bowen's writings.
Mhm. Great. Wonderful. That's a great quote to end our time, Larry. Thanks so much for spending an hour and a half with all of us. I think we've had up to 22 participants today. And just a reminder, folks, about May 20th, do consider being part of that. And thanks so much to Larry Foster for being with us.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks.